So we are recording. Welcome to this Monday evening, October the 4th, 2021. It is in the United States right now, where I think most all of us are located. And this is People's Religious Traditions, for those of you who will be watching this later sometime. All right. Thank you again, John, for coming. I'm going to ask you to share just here briefly, and then we have some interaction with you. But I think it would be helpful to you. And if everyone just very briefly, just say your name and where you're located. And that way, our friend John will have a little bit better understanding of who we all are in this group. All right. Well, as I've mentioned to those of you in the class, John and I met online, and John was very, very kind and gracious to respond to my invitation to meet. And then has been very kind with his time and really his years of study and expertise and practice personally to come and share a bit with you all. I've asked him to share a little bit in particular about Pure Land Buddhism and how it is that that has been where he has gone in his own religious journey. And I think some of you at least had an opportunity to look at the recording of the conversation that John and I had last week for about half an hour as we got to know each other a little bit and interacted some. And so, John, I'll give it to you for a little bit here and then open it up for some time of interaction after that. But again, thank you so very much for your kindness and graciousness in interacting. And I look forward to hearing you share some things now. And I trust we'll have some meaningful and good interaction. Thank you again for being here tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Jennings. I appreciate the invitation. I have certainly regretted the phase of life that we've been in trying to cope with this pandemic and the tragedy that it has been associated with it. But if there's been a very small silver lining, it's been the online opportunities that there have been to communicate with people around the country. And I commend you for having this opportunity to share fellowship and to share knowledge and learning with each other. I, of course, indicated to Dr. Jennings when we had our one-on-one that I have spoken before to groups of students who had no knowledge about Buddhism. And I live in North Carolina, which is basically in the Bible Belt here. And so I'm in a Christian community largely. And there frankly are no Buddhists in my town, and particularly no Buddhists in a particular lineage that I identify with that you'll learn more about this evening. So these online contacts are especially important to me. But again, it results in me having a deeper appreciation and understanding perhaps of the Christian tradition. I tried to think about a way to frame my approach to religion and spirituality in a larger context. And just earlier this evening, for what it's worth, and it may not be worth a whole lot, but one thing was that my significant other, Charlotte, she said, well, one of the purposes of religion is to teach good behavior, pro-social behavior. So I started thinking along a developmental line, and I was thinking, I've got a little chart here, but I'm not sophisticated enough to put it on screen shares, but I'll hold it up. That, in the earlier phases of life, I think maybe part of the purpose of religion is to establish behavioral expectations, particularly ideally pro-social ones, and also to help younger people or people earlier on the path to develop good ego strength and to have a positive self-image and feelings about themselves. But over the course of time, then there may be an expectation of a person to establish themselves in various religion or spiritual practices. And then maybe further on, there's in some cases the establishment of spiritual insight or wisdom. And I want to focus on that latter stage, where basically within Buddhism, we have two kinds of paths. We certainly have practices, and I can talk about those. But the two kinds of paths that exist within Buddhism in terms of these stages of trying to establish greater spiritual insight and wisdom are some that we would call self-power oriented paths. And then there are other power oriented paths. And it's the other power oriented paths that I particularly want to focus on, since that's again, the lineage that I identify with. But just to round out this broader framework is that my premise here would be that within the other power framework, these are the areas of religion or spirituality that are based on faith or on the idea of grace that I know y'all are quite familiar with. And I would make the point that within that sort of category, if you will, of religious experience, that all major religions, I think, have a mystical component or a mystical tradition within the religion that has some of the same elements associated with it. And hopefully, as I communicate some about Shin Buddhism or True Pure Land Buddhism, you may see some parallels between that and some of the Christian traditions. I will make one comment about a book that I think was of use to me early in my study, and that was Aldous Huxley's Perennial Philosophy. And it's not so much that you would find yourself adopting his particular way of thinking about the perennial philosophy, but within this particular book, he puts in a lot of quotes from different religions. So it was helpful in that regard to do some comparison. But what Huxley, how he defined it back in a paper in 1944, he said that the idea within the perennial philosophy is that there is a Godhead or ground, which is the unmanifested principle of all manifestation, and that ground is transcendent and immanent. I think there's I believe it's perhaps a Sanskrit or a Hindu phrase that kind of sums it up in 3 words, which is, that art thou. In other words, that this idea of a separation between us and God in some sense and at some level is kind of an illusion or not ultimately real. But anyway, this was my little thing that I developed just this evening to say, we go along this developmental path, but in the context of a more mature spiritual phase of life, we've got a decision to make whether to pursue this self-power path, which Buddhism says a whole lot about what's involved in this. And it involves practices such as charity, patience, zeal, concentration, and ultimately wisdom or prajna, which is an awareness of the non-duality of reality, an awareness that this idea of a separation between ourselves is in some sense not fundamentally true. But you can try to pursue this self-power path and you can really work at it. And again, the prescriptions are all there within the Buddhist scriptures. But at some point, what most of us would find is that we don't have the capacity to completely fulfill that path to its final supreme enlightenment, is what we would call it in Buddhism, or even becoming a Buddha. So the founder of Jodo Shinshu or Shin Buddhism, this is what he experienced. He became a monk when he was 8 years old, and he followed this self-power path in a Buddhist school called Tendai, which basically had the Lotus Sutra as its fundamental text. And I love the Lotus Sutra, and it's a wonderful, wonderful scripture. And again, all these Buddhist teachings have a great deal to offer. But Shinran, at some point, he said to himself, I can't do this. I mean, I'm just not capable. In other words, we have what Buddhism would talk about as 3 poisons: greed, anger, and ignorance. Greed is the idea that there are things we want to bring toward ourselves. Anger is the sense of aversion, that there are things we don't like that we want to push away from ourselves. And ignorance or delusion is the idea that we view ourselves as a totally separate entity, a separate ego. And our ego keeps us to some extent from experiencing this kind of truth. Now, again, I just want to remind ourselves, particularly with my psychology hat on, I'm a retired psychologist, is that at an earlier point in life or earlier stage of development, I think it's important to be able to establish a strong ego and a strong sense of identity. But at some point, to the extent that we pursue this path, there's a glimpse of a reality that is a false sense of truth, and that there's what I call a mysterious interconnectedness among us, and also this kind of non-dual relationship with the divine. And I can talk more about that. But basically, Shinran, this founder, he fortunately came in contact with a teacher called Honen. And that teacher, Honen, said, all that you have to do is say this phrase, Namo Amida Butsu. They call it the Nembutsu. It means I take refuge in Amida Buddha. And Amida is one of the so-called, I would call him a cosmic spiritual entity, a spiritual being. And his name actually is Amitabha and Amitayus. In other words, he's a Buddha of infinite light. Light represents wisdom, and a Buddha of infinite life. In other words, his lifetime is eternal. So anyway, he heard Honen, and he followed Honen's teaching of the Nembutsu. And the idea here in the earlier form of Pure Land Buddhism, which had a long history in India and then China, and now we're in Japan. We're in 13th century Japan. And Shinran, though, he took this and he evolved it and refined it to its ultimate degree as to become a system of pure grace. Now, before Shinran, this Pure Land tradition, the idea was, if you recite the name of the Buddha, Namo Amida Butsu, if you say Namo Amida Butsu with a sincere heart and an entrusting heart, then you can be reborn. You acknowledge that you're unable to attain this ultimate, accomplishment of Buddhahood in this life. So what happens is when you die, you're reborn in a pure land of happiness. And the idea of this pure land is that there, the impediments or the limitations that we have in this life of these poisons of greed and anger and ignorance, they are no longer hindering us from making rapid progress along the path. So in a way, I think of it as like being in graduate school. You have the opportunity to do full-time study, and you can make rapid progress toward the goal. I'll share a photo of a painting that was associated with a story that was told by one of the earlier Pure Land Buddhists prior to Shinran, during this era when they thought about the Pure Land as a place to gain rapid movement toward Buddhahood. And this particular patriarch was called Shantao. He was Chinese. So he told this story of the white path. And the idea here, if you can see it, is that the fellow down there, if you can see him, he's being followed by various beasts and demons and bad guys. And so he's in a very tough situation. He knows that if he turns around and if they catch him, he's going to die. He's going to be killed. So he's in the world of suffering. He's in this world of samsara. But he sees that this path, this white path before him, it's only 3 or 4 inches wide. And he thinks, I don't think I can travel over that path without falling into the river. And of course, the river, you see the blue side of the river, that represents desire. And the fiery side, that represents hatred or anger. But what you have on the eastern side is you have the historical Buddha, Sakyamuni Buddha. He actually lived 500 years BC, and he was the founder of Buddhism, and he was a real figure, a real historical figure. And he's telling the guy, you're okay, go forward, you'll be safe. Just go across that path and it'll be cool. And then on the other side, on the western side, is a representation of Amida Buddha. And he's beckoning to the guy and he's saying, come on now, come on the path and, I'll protect you and I'll make sure you get across safely. And of course, if he does, then he's in the Pure Land. So, I like Buddhist art in addition to the doctrines and the teachings, and that is one example of a story that was told and that represents some of these things in artistic form. But just to come to the bottom line in terms of Shin Buddhism or Jodo Shinshu, Jodo Shinshu means the essence of the essence of true Pure Land Buddhism, the essence of Pure Land Buddhism. And this was, even though Shinran didn't think he founded anything, in fact, he founded the Jodo Shinshu sect, which you don't hear about it much in the West, but the more tens of millions of Buddhists in the world have been Pure Land Buddhists than any other type of Buddhism. In this country, we hear about Zen, and we hear about Tibetan Buddhism, and we hear about Theravada Buddhism, and I could speak to those sects and schools, but the point is Pure Land was the most popular, and again, Shinran took it to its ultimate degree. So what was his thought? His interpretation of the teachings is that when we had, oh, by the way, with Honen and some of the earlier ones, they felt like you had to repeat this Nembutsu over and over and over again. And an even earlier time, they felt like you had to say it at the time of death or else you weren't going to go to the Pure Land. What Shinran says is, if you say it one time, and you don't even have to say it, you just think it with an entrusting heart, entrustment, that's the key dynamic. If you have that moment where you realize, I am limited, I am not capable, I am filled with evil, if you want to use that term, in the sense that we're very selfish. We may not always acknowledge it to ourselves, but we're very self-oriented. We want what we want. And if we acknowledge that and have even for one moment that entrustment in the vow that was made in the narrative of Shin Buddhism, and I'll mention something about the narrative, then that's it. We are given assurance of being reborn in that Pure Land when we die. Number one. Number two, when we are reborn, it's not like grad school. We immediately become a Buddha. And when we become a Buddha, we can come back to this Saha land, back to this land of suffering in various forms, and to help people, other people with their suffering, which we weren't able to do in this earthly life. So the story behind this is that, and again, this is, I'm going to call it mythopoetic, okay, is that there was this cosmic bodhisattva. A bodhisattva is a person, a figure who is a Buddha to be. They strive to be a Buddha. And the way they do it is to take the self-power path, okay? And so there was this cosmic bodhisattva called Dharmakara Bodhisattva. And in the presence of this cosmic Buddha called Lokesvara Raja Buddha, he made 48 vows, very sincere vows. And his 18th vow was this. He said, I will not attain Buddhahood unless when I become a Buddha, I can establish a Pure Land where anybody who has faith in me can be reborn there when they die. Okay, that was his vow. And then what he did, he worked for eons of time practicing all these things that are in the scriptures regarding the Bodhisattva path in order to establish all this merit, okay? And in a way, the way I think of it is that this form of Buddhism has a concept, something like merit transference. So I have bad karma, okay, because of all the past, all the negative things. And these are the things that keep me from attaining Buddhahood in this life. But it's as a result of all this good karma that Dharmakara accumulated. That's what gives the vow its power. So the 18th vow of Dharmakara Bodhisattva, that's the basis within this narrative that he can transfer this merit, transfer this virtue to us. And that as a result of that, our benefit in this life is to be assured that we are grasped, never to be abandoned. And we are 100% confident that we could be reborn in his land of bliss when we die. So that's Shin Buddhism in a nutshell.
John, thank you. I think I mentioned to the rest of you all how, I mean, you can tell how long John has studied and has incorporated personally and intellectually and through his study in ways where I just always appreciate people who can explain a great deal amount of material, but do so in ways that communicate and convey things instead of, I mean, that was a lot, that was a 10 mouthfuls of information. And thank you for that, John, and for doing so in a way that is understandable and makes key points.
Let me make another key point that has
Okay.
applicability across religions, if I may.
Yeah.
There's, I won't say controversy, but there are different views within Shin Buddhism along this line, and I think you may find the same in Christianity, but I'd be interested in your comments in this regard. In terms of the continuum of literalness, concreteness versus symbolic, metaphorical, okay? And I'm just going to throw that out there, and I've got some comments in that regard. But one of the things the historical Buddha taught, and there's a reason why he taught this, was he taught a middle path. He tried to attain Buddhahood through asceticism, through basically starving himself, and he realized that didn't work. And he knew that self-indulgence didn't work because he was born a prince and had every benefit in the world. But he ended up realizing that the path is more of a middle path between extremes, and that's the position I take. And I would be glad to explain more about how I think about that. There are people who take it very literally, and if you say anything implying anything other than that, they take offense and really kick you out of the group. Which on the other hand, there are people who take a much more exclusively metaphorical kind of approach, and I don't think they're really getting at the nature of the truth that's associated with this narrative in terms of how it resonates with us, given the fact that the way our brain works is dualistically. We think in terms of discriminations between this versus that. And that's not the nature of true reality. The nature of true reality is non-dual. And so, yet we have to have some way of explaining these things and having a worldview and a way of thinking about the fact what happens when we die. And I think certain of these spiritual or religious belief systems help resonate with us and have a kind of deep truth that's valid, basically, in terms of our seeking peace.
Well, thank you. All right, is some time for some questions or discussion points others of you might want to raise. This is a great opportunity for interaction. I think you already realize that our friend John is very approachable and is very happy to entertain what questions or discussion points you want to raise. And so who'd like to go first on that? All right, Chris.
John, thank you. Thank you. It's nice to meet you and to hear, honestly, a lot more than I had expected. That was tremendous. And yeah, you said like 10 mouthfuls easy. It was like a small book in about 5 minutes. So thank you. One thing I'm wondering, what I've read and what you've expressed, what is merit? I mean, how do you define merit, and what does that look like when you say that the Buddha works, whatever he's doing is in favor for you as far as reaching your would nirvana be appropriate word there, or
Yes. Okay, that's a great question. Merit would be accrued as a function of following and pursuing and practicing the elements of the bodhisattva path. Okay, so what does that mean? I said a bodhisattva has an aspiration for Buddhahood, and there's a detailed description of the different stages and the different practices associated with this. But the essence of it is that the bodhisattva takes vows, all bodhisattvas, and there are humans on earth who take bodhisattva vows. And the essence of the vow is, let me back up. Shin Buddhism or Pure Land Buddhism is one school within Mahayana Buddhism, or the Great Vehicle school of Buddhism, which is the major tradition under which Pure Land is a school, okay? What does the word Mahayana mean? It means great vehicle. Okay, they called it Mahayana in contrast with the earlier form of Buddhism, which we think of now as Theravadan Buddhism. But the Mahayanists, they called the Theravadan Buddhism, they called it the Hinayana, or the little vehicle, okay? In other words, the Theravadan school was established with the historical Buddha, 500 BC. The Mahayanists came about at around 100 AD, okay? And so there were a lot of prescriptions that people thought the Buddha was teaching in the Theravadan school as to how to achieve nirvana, which was to end the cycle of births and deaths, But what the Mahayanists said was, what those guys are doing really is kind of selfish, because what they're doing is they're practicing, but they're practicing in order to accomplish their own salvation, okay? Now, see if this logic makes sense. In Mahayana, there's a tremendous emphasis on wisdom. The word is prajna, Prajna, the most important concept. The nature of prajna is an experience of this non-dual consciousness, this awareness that the idea that I exist fundamentally as a separate self, totally separate, or that anything exists totally separate, is an illusion. Now, see if this logic follows. That if, in fact, I am connected in a mysterious, inconceivable way with all other beings, how would it make sense for me to establish nirvana or enlightenment or salvation only for myself? So what the wisdom leads to is compassion, okay? So these are the two key attributes, are wisdom and compassion, okay? So in the spirit, so in the spirit of this compassionate feeling, the Bodhisattva says, I will defer my own enlightenment. I will not attain enlightenment until I can help all beings to relieve of their suffering and to attain enlightenment. In other words, the idea is, instead of a small vehicle to go from this shore of suffering to the other shore of nirvana, we want a big ship. We want a huge ship that everybody can get on board with to get to the other shore, okay? So again, that's not telling you what the specific practices are, but it's in conducting themselves with those practices, which are basically oriented toward helping beings to be relieved of their suffering. That is the way the Bodhisattva accrues merit.
Chris, you want to follow up? Or is that good?
So if I understand it correctly, then the 48 vows are the sacrificial elements of the Bodhisattva in order for all to achieve enlightenment. Is that right?
You have just hit on a nail on the head with, again, all due respect, and I could be totally wrong about this, Dr. Jennings, but you have hit on the head with the use of the word sacrificial, how I see a connection between Shin Buddhism and Christianity. I think there's a similar dynamic there between the sacrifice Jesus made and the sacrifice that was represented by this bodhisattva, this most profound bodhisattva vow. That's correct.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great. Others of you? As I've assured you before in previous discussion times, no question is too simple or off base. Oftentimes it's the ones you think that's a dumb question. Those are the best questions often.
Yeah, and I should have prefaced the whole thing by saying, hey, yeah, I got turned on to Buddhism about 40 years ago. but I'm not ordained. I'm not a scholar. I'm not, I'm a retired psychologist with time on my hands. So I have the opportunity to dive into this stuff. Hey, John.
Hi, John. Would you mind if I ask some questions?
Absolutely not. Don't mind it.
You mentioned the self-powered track and also the other powered track. And you mentioned Buddha is the historical figure, he's a man, and he somehow attained Buddhahood. So should I look at this as a person who became a divine being through the process of doing so? And in that case, if he can attain Buddhahood by his self-powered, why can't I do that?
Okay, there are a lot of questions and a lot of things to unpack there. To give one simple, concrete answer to the last part of your question is that in Shinran's time, there was lots of bad stuff going on in Japan. I can't outline it all for you, but there were wars going on. There was famine going on. And so there's a concept within Buddhism called Mappo, M-A-P-P-O. And Shinran and Honen, they both, look toward this as a way of explaining some things. The basic concept, John, is that the way the thinking was that, okay, you had your historical Buddha who did attain Buddhahood. He accomplished it. I could talk more about how he did that in terms of, the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. That's the core of the Theravadan teaching. But basically the idea was that the teaching would be intact for 500 years after the Buddha's death. And that for 500 years after that, it would be pretty accessible. But 500 years after that, it was so distant from the historical Buddha that would be what would make it impossible to attain Buddhahood for any individual at that time. Okay, that's part of how they explained that. But of course, there were Buddhists, and there are today, who feel like that they can attain that same kind of enlightenment. And in fact, Tibetan Buddhists have practices now today with the objective of becoming enlightened. Let me call it becoming enlightened, not necessarily becoming Buddha. One of my friends, a psychologist colleague, he studied Zen Buddhism, and in his opinion, one of the people who is closest to that kind of attainment in our era is Krishnamurti. In other words, again, this doesn't have to be necessarily in the context of Buddhist ideology or religion. So, myself, I think it's probably possible, but for 99.9% of the people, it's probably not. And what I can attest to is it's not possible for me because I tried it. I mean, I tried to pursue a bodhisattva kind of path, and I wasn't able to do it. It's almost like you would have to be devoting full time to these altruistic kinds of practices and this meditation to be able to gain this non-dual consciousness, which would be very, very difficult to do on a consistent basis. Now, you asked another important question there, and I'm glad for you to follow up on that one if that's not satisfactory. But again, the historical Buddha, Sakyamuni, born a prince, his dad, when he was born, there was some kind of a wise man or a guy who supposedly could see into the future. He told his father was a king, and he told the king, he says, you probably read this in your books, your son, he's either going to be a great king or he's going to be a great holy man. And of course, dad didn't want him to become a holy man. He wanted to become a king. So he sheltered him and didn't allow him out of the castle grounds. Eventually, though, he got out of the grounds, he saw the suffering, and he wanted to solve the problem of suffering. And he tried these different things for 6 years and finally became enlightened. But again, in the later scriptures after his death, and I'll point to one in particular, and I would really highlight this as a book you might actually want to get hold of a copy. The book, the one you would want to get hold of is called The Threefold Lotus Sutra. There are 2 translations of it, and it's actually 3 sutras, but the middle one is called the Lotus Sutra, the Lotus of the Wonderful Law. And the Lotus Sutra has two very, very important teachings in chapter 2 and in chapter 16. And in chapter 16, the teaching is, even though Buddha said that he passed into nirvana at age 85, he really didn't. That his life was really eternal. The length of his life was really infinite, back into the past and on into the future. So it sounds like that the answer to your question is in terms of the literature, in terms of the scriptures, what they were trying to do with that great Mahayana Sutra or scripture was to transform the historical Buddha into a divine entity. Now, let me use this as a kickoff for sharing something called the Trikaya doctrine, Trikaya. And this may help answer your question. Here's how Buddhism envisions the nature of Buddhahood. The ultimate Buddha body, kaya means body, okay? Dharmakaya means truth body or law body. The Dharmakaya, which I think is somewhat equivalent to the Godhead, cannot be characterized by any words or concepts, okay? The Dharmakaya is, a Baha'i friend of mine called this the ineffable essence, something along that line. And again, I think any one of these mystical religious strands of a particular religious tradition, the mystical part of it is that the nature of God, if you will, the nature of the Godhead is it can't be described by any words or concepts, okay? So you got three levels. Flipping down to the human level is the Nirmanakaya, the form body. Nirmana means form. So because the Buddha realized that, human beings, we need somebody that looks like us and who can teach us in the way that we can understand. So the Buddha, the Dharmakaya, manifests itself as the form body. And this view would judge Sakyamuni Buddha, the historical Buddha, to be a form body of the Dharmakaya, okay? And a real person who, if you want to think of it as divine, you can think of it as divine, but the point is an emanation of the Dharmakaya. Now there's a middle level that's very interesting, the Sambhogakaya, the bliss body. I think of it as the spiritual level. And in the spiritual level, we have these, divine kind of entities, a whole bunch of what I call cosmic Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. And this Amida Buddha that I talked about, he's one of the, I would think of him as a Sambhogakaya. And the Sambhogakaya level can be characterized, and their main attributes, again, are wisdom and compassion, but at a much broader level. So that in the Lotus Sutra, for example, we see that one of the main emanations from Amida Buddha is a cosmic bodhisattva called Avalokiteshvara. And what that word in Sanskrit means is regarder of the cries of the world. So Avalokiteshvara represents infinite compassion. Now, as this figure who's in the sutra, as the sutra gets translated from India to China, the figure, in terms of artistic forms and iconography, transfers from a male to a female form. And she's called Kuan Yin. In the West, you may see her in furniture stores or other places called the goddess of the East, Kuan Yin. But Kuan Yin is just a Chinese word for regarder of the cries of the world. And so for a lot of common people, the idea of Amida Buddha is even too big, much less Dharmakaya. So Amida seems awfully far away, but Kuan Yin is close and personal, okay? And so again, there's the Sambhogakaya level with all these cosmic Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and you see them described in the different sutras or scriptures within Mahayana Buddhism.
Thank you. It's very informative. I guess it would take me many hours of unpacking to understand everything that you said.
John, let me ask a follow-up question to that on John's behalf, if I could. how helpful is it for those of us who think in Christian categories, and I'll even add maybe those of us who think in Western Christian categories, but how helpful is it to think of the historic Buddha as an incarnation of the eternal Buddha? How is that helpful, and how might that be misleading?
From what I understand, John's explanation is the physical body, the form body, is an infused divinity, not exactly the same as the incarnation that we have in Christianity. I'm not sure I'm understanding this correctly, so please correct me if I'm wrong.
That's probably a pretty good way of describing it, John, because that we would not say that he is divine in the same way that a Christian might view Jesus. Infused, I like that term. I like that term because with his insights, with his enlightenment, he was infused with a consciousness that went beyond the scope of most humans. But he very much preached that this is a path that other humans can tread. And so, yeah, in that sense, he's not viewed as a unique manifestation. I'm sorry, Dr. Jennings, I think I interrupted.
No, that's good. Thank you. I'm wondering if others of you might want to ask or bring something up.
Hi, John. Thanks again
Hi.
for coming. I'm trying to formulate the question in my head, so I'm sorry if it's.
Take your time.
Yeah, no, thank you. Because if I understand what you're saying correctly, and do please correct me if I'm wrong, the aspect of Pure Land Buddhism is this underlying sense of compassion, of reaching out and wanting to bring sort of everybody along in this path. And that differentiates from and I'm so sorry, I can't say the word correctly for the original Buddhism. Yeah, because that one was a little vessel, which was just focused on one person. And then you mentioned that you've been exploring this for the last 40 years, and that you tried to do the little vessel path and then found it seems more comfort with the big vessel path, if I understand correctly. And so I guess I wanted to ask, how did you come to find all of this? And if you're comfortable, it helped me understand more your personal or your journey into this sort of exploration. And because you did say 4 books very well in a very short time.
It's not that I tried to pursue the Theravada path. I tried to pursue the self-power path within the Mahayana school. I tried to follow the Bodhisattva path. That's within the self-power. But your question is a good one. And it's a very personal one. So here's the thing. When I was about 31, I had a spiritual awakening, whatever you want to call it, a religious conversion experience. I didn't have any religious framework at the time. And so that's when I kind of dived in and did some study and tried to figure out what this experience was, because all of a sudden I had this sense of peace that I hadn't previously experienced. And I experienced it in the context of a personal crisis. So I was going through something very tough for myself. And I just, and I'll tell you, I got down on my knees and asked for help, and then had this experience of relief from suffering and sense of joy. And so I felt a sense of wanting to figure out what this was. And to make a long story short, I did encounter somebody in my home community who did follow the Pure Land path, and she helped me learn about it and become familiar with it. And that's how I got onto that track after I had tried this more difficult self-power path and realized that I was a failure at it. But I want to make the final point there that in this other power path, even this sense of entrustment, is a gift given to us from Amida, according to this Shin Buddhist doctrine. But for me, it started with a personal crisis that that resulted in a kind of spiritual awakening that I found myself best able to understand through this through this Shin Buddhist narrative.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And then I guess then, because it seems like with Pure Land Buddhism, there's such a, like you said, I guess, and you put it really well, emphasis on grace, like this sort of
Absolutely.
entrustment,
That's
right?
exactly right.
Right. And so then it seems like that, oh, because then my follow-up question, and that might be just because I think in maybe too practical of terms, but even in talking with you, it seems like it's really impacted the way that you lived, right? And then like how, and I guess that would be my question is like, how has that played out? Because I mean, you know, sorry.
No, that's a great question. And it brings up this point, this very, very important point, is that us Shin Buddhists, we don't have any practice, okay? In other words, we've been given this assurance of rebirth. That's when we become Buddha. This has been a gift to us, even the sense of entrustment. So it is pure grace, and we have no practice. So that even when I say the Nembutsu, and I will say it very often, I'll say Namo Mita Boots, Namo Mita Boots, Namo Mita Boots. But when I say it, it's an expression of gratitude for what's been given. It's not petitionary prayer, at least in the formal doctrinal sense. Now, I'm not saying there aren't Shin Buddhists around the world who, you know, are asking for help when they say Namo Mita Butsu. But the point is, in a technical sense, it's an expression of gratitude. Now, the founder, Shinran, he made the point, he says, he had a disciple, and he said, he was teaching the disciple, and he said, this whole issue of, you know, there's a concept called antinomianism. In other words, the idea is if there's no practice to be had, and if you're guaranteed rebirth, well, are you going to go out and do evil things just for the sake of doing evil because, you know, you're free to do it and it won't be an obstacle to your entering the Pure Land? And what Shinran said is, just because there's an antidote doesn't mean you should take a poison. And he also made the point with a disciple. He said to the guy, he said, I want you to go out and kill 1,000 people. And he said, you're my disciple. You said you're going to do anything I told you to do. You go out and kill 1,000 people. And the guy said, I can't kill 1,000. I can't even kill one person. And he made the point that that's because of his karma. In other words, he didn't have it within him to do evil. So, but on the other hand, if somebody's makeup is such that they end up doing bad things, this vow of Dharmakara Bodhisattva, this 18th vow, it has the power to overcome any evil act. In fact, Shinran argued that the vow was especially made for the evil person, even though ordinarily in terms of common sense, we might think it was made for the good person, but it's actually made for the evil person. But as far as myself, I just try to, you know, live my life as best I can. And I had hopefully a pretty successful career, and I tried to raise a son right and, you know, try to help people. And, you know, now on this YouTube channel, I try to share the teachings, but I try to recognize with humility the fact that, you know, these aren't things that should, you know, make my ego get too big.
Thank you, John. We have just a couple of minutes left. I'd like to ask you one different sort of a question, and it has to do with, I'll call it cultural identity. You know, a whole big topic for further discussion to lead into the question is the fact that I see Christianity and Buddhism in general having a very strong similar trait of being translatable. You've already referred to that. It's going from India to China to Korea and Japan. And as the sutras are translated, some certain understandings and nuances shift a little bit. But with the Christian faith, similarly, the scriptures are translatable. And there are different sorts of nuances and meanings that happen. There's a filling out that happens when the religion comes into different cultural homes. Even with that, though, in terms of I'll just call it people's general impressions, Buddhism, at least from most Western people's point of view, is more of an Eastern religion. For yourself, you're not an Easterner in a global sort of a sense. You're a white US American. How have you worked through being a Buddhist, a Shin Buddhist, but a Buddhist as a white US American? How have you worked through that in terms of your own cultural identity? You've used the phrase "we Shin Buddhists." You've worked through that clearly. How have you done that?
Not with great ease. There is an organization in the United States called the Buddhist Churches of America, and it's frankly probably the biggest Buddhist organization in the United States, even though y'all have probably never heard of it. But it was formulated by Japanese immigrants. And I have not actually formally joined any religious organization until just within the last year. I joined the West Los Angeles Buddhist temple. And they always, and I go to the services and teachings online, and they always do the services part in English and part in Japanese. But you know about the history of the Japanese internment camps in World War II. And so these churches, and they call them churches, and they have pews, and they look like Christian churches because they try to assimilate to the Western Christian kind of framework. But the point is this: because of the horrific situation with the internment camps, early on, and even in my early days as a Buddhist 40 years ago, they didn't have a strong outreach for us, what they call Caucasians, okay? They didn't have as much outreach to Westerners. And so it was a little harder to break through and to have a closer relationship. Now, it so happened there was one guy who was a former bishop of the BCA who established a temple up in the Washington, D.C. area called Ikoji, and he kind of took a number of us under his wing, and I'm eternally grateful for Reverend Suji. But even today, a lot of the Shin Buddhist culture, from that standpoint, Dr. Jennings, is Japanese, and a lot of the ministers are from Japan. So it's not easy. And I already had a career established. So if I had been younger, I might have become a minister. I might have, which would have involved going to Japan and going to university there and all this kind of thing. But the point is that it's not been easy, given that it is a different culture. Now, with some other Buddhist schools, it's been much, much easier. Like Zen Buddhism, and particularly the sect of Soto Zen, that's largely Westerners now, in terms of the different Zen groups around the country. In terms of Tibetan, the actual people who left Tibet because of China invading them, they're still very actively involved, and so there's a strong cultural element there. But anyway, those are some comments I have about it. I resonate with the doctrine, and so that allows me to, be willing to overcome some of the cultural hurdles.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, this has been such a tremendous time together. Thank you so much. And I think all of us appreciate so much, John, your sharing your wisdom and interacting with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.